In this session, what we are going to learn is a very important concept in this trend of era, which is gap assessment. Right? This is very much needed in this cybersecurity world to understand what exactly are the gaps in your environment. Right? So generally, from Azure side or from Devops side or from Office 365 side or from an infrastructure perspective side, there are multiple gap assessments available, right? What we are going to see today is 3 to 4 types of gap assessment, right? One is on Office 365 side. What are all the different gaps that we can analyze it? The next one we are going to see is on Azure cloud side. What are all the different gap assessments that you can do it on Azure side? The next one is on Active Directory side, and let's call this as Azure Active Directory side. And then we are going to look into DevOps, right? So these four are very important for a cloud or a DevOps engineer in day-to-day world, because you need to take care of your environments and you need to know what kind of gaps is available on your particular environment, right? Let's look into it, each and everything, like what are all the different gaps that we are seeing it, right? So on Office 365 side, right? So what are all the different gaps that we are trying to look into it, right? So we will just see and users, groups, licenses assessment, right? So what are all the different users available? How many users have been created? How many groups are there? How many active users are there? How many active groups are there? How many inactive users? How many inactive licenses? To understand how much of the cost optimization that we can try to do. The next we will do is Teams assessment. So what are all the different options available on the Teams? How many channels they have? What is a procedure they have? Whether all the groups are enabled, whether anyone can send anything on the Teams, is there any whitelisting happening, and how much of the data is being transferred, what is the network bandwidth of the Teams. So everything we will try to analyze on the Teams assessment. The next is your OneDrive or SharePoint assessment. So we will just try to see how many SharePoint sites are created, how many active sites are there, how many sites that is being just created but not used, so that the space is getting wasted. All those things will be analyzed on the SharePoint. Exchange Online is a very important area where we have to focus a lot on Office 365, because this is where your email gateway and your email security lies, right? So we have to first understand what is your quarantine rules, what is your threat protection rules, what is your anti-spam policies, what is your SPF records, what is your DKIM records, what is your DMARC records. All these things are very important to analyze on your Exchange Online. The next is Purview assessment. So this purview is one of the very important compliance requirement for any organizations, right? So this is where your data protection and data loss prevention policies and records management, information protection, labels, all those things will be part of it. And there is a separate compliance score available on each and every Office 365 apart from your security score, right? So we will try to analyze the compliance with each and every options. The next is your MDM, which is nothing but your Intune, right? So this is where we will try to analyze whether your mobile device management is being handled by your organization. What is the configuration policies being set up? What is the profiles being set up? How many devices are onboarded? How many devices are compliant? How many devices are non-compliant? What is a password policy? So everything will be analyzed on this particular MDM assessment. And finally, what we'll do is like the security assessment, which is nothing but your defender for endpoints, right? So we will try to check what is your security aspects of it, whether the defender is being enabled for all the endpoints, whether the defender is enabled for all the cloud resources, and what is the defender policy being set up, whether the vulnerability assessment is being done, and all those assessments will be done on this security side, right? So these are all the different categories of assessment that will be done on your Office 365, and we have to prepare reports accordingly to all this assessment, right? Then we come to the cloud area, right? So this is a broader scope because cloud has lots and lots of resources inside it, and each organizations will be using a different resources according to their needs, right? So from the cloud perspective, we will try to analyze all the infrastructure as a service assessment. This covers all the virtual machines and VM as a service or VM scale sets, the SQL missions, all those things will come under this infrastructure as a service assessments. Then we will go to the platform as a service assessments, where all your web apps, function apps, logic apps, SQL services, Cosmos, and all those other areas will be coming into this service assessments, right? We will see all the best practices, like how a web apps is being designed, whether the port is being exposed, or if there is any private endpoints is there or not, and is the CNAME being properly configured, is an SSL certificate being properly configured, is a key vault being properly configured and used, have we used an RBAC policies, is an IAM properly set up. All those things will be assessed over here, right? And there will be a separate assessments that will be done on a database side, which is called as a SQL assessment, where we will do a SQL fine tuning, and we will find out if the SQL is taking too much amount of time for querying, and the CPU of the SQL, which is nothing but a DTU, okay, database transaction unit, is going so high that your database is getting failed always, and what is the reason for it, which query is taking a long time. We will try to analyze everything on this SQL assessment, right? Then comes your backup assessment, because this is one of the very important factor on the cloud called as backups, right? For every resource there is a backup. Like for example, web apps has its own backup mechanisms, SQL, which means database, has its own backup mechanisms, virtual machines has its own backup mechanisms. So how a backup is being set up for an organization, and how it is to be done as per the normal standards and the best practices, right? Then we will try to look into your monitoring and logging assessment. Is the application insights being properly set up? Is the log analytics being properly configured? Are we trying to capture the logs from all the workplaces? Is all the logs being transferred properly? Is the dashboards being set up? Everything will be assessed over here. And then the very important thing is an orphaned resources. Orphaned resources is nothing but whether the resources that has been created in Azure is used properly or not, or is it just been created and not used at all. So in that case, the cost will go high, and unnecessary usage of the resources will also be there. So those are all coming under your orphaned resources. Finally, we will look into your security score and advisor recommendations to find out whether the security score of an Azure is going high. If not, we will follow the recommendations as per the best practices from Microsoft to improvise and increase the security score, right? So these are all the different types of assessment that we will be doing it on Office 365 and Azure Cloud, right? The other two services is Devops and Azure AD, right? So this too is again a very important gap assessment that has to be done by any DevOps engineer or an cloud administrator, right? From the DevOps perspective, what are all the things that we are trying to do? So we will try to do a repository based assessment, and we will try to do a boards assessment. Boards is nothing but a kind of Kanban boards or a Jira boards and other things that we will try to do. And a CI/CD assessment is your pipelines being set up properly, and what are all the different things that is there in Azure, and what are all the DevOps pipelines is being configured and other things. And then we will try to do a test assessment, which is nothing but test plans, right? So whether your Selenium test cases is being there properly, and your test plans are set up properly and everything. And artifacts, whether all the build outputs are getting properly configured and it has been version controlled properly and everything. And then we will try to look into an agents base, whether we are using a Microsoft hosted agent or a self-hosted agent, or if it is a self-hosted agent, how much of the CPU memory RAM it is being happening and other things. And a role-based access control assessment. So for every repository, is there any special permissions being set up? For every pipelines, is there any special permissions being set up and everything? And library assessment, whether the secrets, the key vault data, and the variable groups and everything is being set up properly on the libraries, and it is used properly on the DevOps pipelines and everything. And finally, we go with a document-based assessment, whether the documents are being captured properly on the wiki, and whether everything is being captured on the dashboard and everything, right? So these are all the different DevOps-based assessments, which we will try to do it as part of your complete gaps, right? Finally, we come with Azure AD assessment. And Azure AD assessment is nothing but that's a very important place where all your users and groups will be part of it. And this is a one place which connects to all the other tools and services and everything. Because once if you connect an Azure AD to any of the tools, then automatically it becomes an SSO, which is single sign-on login, right? So this Azure AD based assessment is very important for us to find out the gaps. What are all the things that we try to do it? We try to follow an IAM assessment, which is Identity Access Management Assessment, and conditional access, whether the conditional access is being set up properly and whether the rules are being captured properly, whether the audit logs is being captured properly. MFA assessment, multi-factor authentication, whether multi-factor authentication is set up for all the users, including the guest users, or if there is something missed out, then we have to do it on our own. And then the audit based assessment, whether all the audit logs are getting captured, whether the user sign in logs are getting captured, or if signed failed logs are getting captured, the risk based logs are getting captured or not. So all those things has to be assessed. Identity protection has to be identified. And PIM, which is Privileged Identity Management Assessment, whether we have a PIM based setup, so that who is authorized to give a permission and what type of permissions, whether they have, whether they are always on an active permissions or whether they are on the eligible permissions and everything. And just-in-time access, so whether we have multiple VMs, and the VM based accessing can be done using a just-in-time assessment. And applications and enterprise applications assessment, so what are all the different applications that we have on Azure, and what are all the different permissions for that, how do we handle that, and all those things will be done with this applications and enterprise applications assessment. And finally, what is the Active Directory backup assessment, because Active Directory is prone to failure, right? So are we taking a regular backups for this Active Directory, and if some failures or anything happens, then how do we handle it, right? So these are all the gap assessment strategies with the different components that we try to do it, and we will prepare a report accordingly, and then we will try to remediate each and every gaps in accordance with the proper process. So I hope you guys would have understand what is a gap assessment and what are all the different gap assessments are available, so that an Azure or a DevOps engineer can do it, right? If you have any doubts or anything, feel free to reach out to me and I'll be happy to help you guys across, right? Thank you.